I believe that's live. We're going to give it a second. If you are coming into this as a live streamer, or if you are, well, no one's live yet. If you're watching this as a recording, remember we're doing We the People, chapter 14 today. So the slides are always in my files, right? So you go to Web Campus and you go to Files. We the People, chapter 14. We're going to do chapter 14 and 15 this week. Your papers are due Thursday. So submit something, right? Anything is better than a 0, right? A 0 is always the worst case scenario. So make sure you try and do a paper. Even if you don't have a lot of experience, right? Make sure that you put this in. Okay, that's not what I want to do. This one's what I want to do. Okay. So let's go into this and let's get some statistics. All right, so those of you who can't see it to the live stream, but right now I'm bringing up the quiz summary, the statistics for exam 3. So I see that the average time was 34 minutes and the average score was 80%. That's really good, right? We had some low scoring attempts, right? But 80% is about average. I might still adjust this a bit. 34-minute average time is a little low. I'm pretty sure I gave you 50 minutes. I hope I did, right? I'm going to review these questions. I'm not going to review these questions in front of you, right? I'm not going to go through the question breakdown. That would take most of our class, and I don't think it's worthwhile. But it looks like the test fit exactly where I wanted. For those of you that took the sort of exam prep quiz, right, that wasn't worth any points, something you might have noticed is they're the exact same questions, right? I pulled from this quiz to make that practice quiz, which means if you took it once or twice, you got about 5 to 8 questions in the exam that you should have been expected to know, right? So it could not have prepared you more, right? I don't know how many people actually took it, so let's bring this up, and then let me bring up the exam prep, right? Let's look at this quiz statistics, right? And we see that right, I did not have a lot of people. I had 1 or 2 people take this, right? That I had a few people take this, right? So there wasn't a lot of people taking this. This would have prepared you, right? That's why I made it a preparatory quiz. I realized that last week was insane, right? I understand that, right? I understand how crazy last week was. I understand how much stress that most of you had, how much the news was playing a role in your life. 80% is pretty good. When I look at your grade breakdown, you might get some emails about what is possible and what is necessary, right? I have enough information at the end of this week once I get the papers. So around Friday, Saturday, I'm going to be telling you, like, here's the best possible outcome for you in this class. Here's what you need to do to get that best possible outcome. And I should send an email to almost every student. The only students I will not be sending email to is A students, right? If you don't get an A email, you should know, right, that you have an A in the class. We don't need to discuss anymore. You're at that point. Let me go back to the live stream. Let's go. All right, so now let's just get into bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is actually becoming one of my specialties, right? Especially how the bureaucracy works, why it matters, right? What it can do in a democracy. And one of the things about bureaucracy, I want to be able to switch back and forth. Okay. One of the things about bureaucracy is it has a very specific role, right? Its job is to do the day-to-day structural work, right? The bureaucracy doesn't choose the policies or the preference. It does choose, right, how those things are implemented, right? That's when we talked about the president in the last section of the course, right? The bureaucracy really plays a huge role in this aspect because it sets up a very specific type of behavior, right? And that's rules-based decision-making. And why is that so important to a democracy? Because each one of you want to be treated the same when you go into the DMV. Each one of you want to be treated the same when you go to a courthouse, right? Whatever it is, good thing, bad thing, doesn't matter, right? You all want to know that the system that we have treats you the same regardless of your background, your ethnicity, your religion, your sexual preference, right? All of that should not matter to the government. They should just be processing you as an individual without those characteristics implied, right? Now we'll talk about sometimes they may have to make special exceptions, right? The bureaucracy is one of the first parts of government to really deal with disabilities, right? We noticed that in speeches this weekend, we talked about disability, right? Disability is a sort of 21st century, really, it wasn't until the late 20th century that we really assessed that there needed to be some accommodations for people with disabilities. And now, right, and moving into the 21st century, that people with disabilities have to be given opportunities, right? That there has to be some way for them to succeed, right? Everyone in this country has to have an opportunity, right? Now, I'm not picking sides, right? I am not political, right? I do not voice my political opinion in front of you, right? I'm just talking about what we heard this week, right? And we just happen to have heard more from one side or the other, right? We'll see about the outcome, right? I also am not going to talk about the outcome of the elections because we still have a lot of stuff that's undecided. Not necessarily in that part, right? But we know that Georgia still has a two seats, or 2 Senate seats that are going to be runoffs, right? So there's still a lot of undecided. So I'm not really going to talk about what happened. I don't have the data yet on how the issues came out. So at the end of the semester, we might have a portion we talk about like how people voted and the breakout. And we talked about minorities and ethnicities. So at the end of the course, that'll be a time when we can discuss like, here are some things that we learned from the election, right? But I will be very clear, those parts I want to set to the very end because those will be times when you will come in, those will not be on the final exam. Those will be things that you can say, okay, I wanted to talk about these things. I wanted to learn about these things, right? Those are for people who want to be political science majors who are sort of Americanists. We can discuss at the end of the semester. All right, so let's just get into this. So the definition of bureaucracy is sort of is this idea of rules by offices and desks. And by offices and desks, I don't mean the actual structures. I mean people at certain desks filling specific roles, right? The office, the executive office of the president is an office that fills a very specific role, right? And we talk about this, that they have a lot of principles of organization, right? A lot of times the rules change, the tasks change, right? What the bureaucracy is expected to do is dependent on what the elected officials want it to do. But the principles of organization really hold the same regardless of who's in power or what the preferences are. And there's these 3 features. As I already talked about, you want rules applied to people in the same way, right? If I have 2 students come to me and they both ask for extra credit, I should say yes to both or no to both, right? That should be the answer, right? There should be no special treatment among students. Now, obviously there will be some specific cases where treatment is allowed, right? There's the DRC, there's other characteristics, right? There's testing another language for people who, I don't even think we have a TOEFL program here, but people who are exchange students of a foreign language, right? There has to be those accommodations, but basically we want everyone to be held to the same standard and the rules apply the same way, right? And when I have a rule that says, okay, you can only get extra credit if you turn in all assignments, that's universal application because everyone can do all of the assignments. Right? So sometimes it might be that you can't do this because of the situation you're in, but that's because of past behavior, not because of personal characteristics. And that's the rules we want to make, right? They apply to the same way and they don't care about characteristics they do care about, right? Can you get a driver's license? Some of you will go through a harder hoops or went through harder hoops because you got them before you were 18, right? I actually got mine in the Army. It was much, much easier because I got it after 18, right? So there are other aspects that we'll talk about. The next part is that interactions are documented. And this is why politics and bureaucracy are very, very different. Bureaucracy is as transparent as it can be, despite some technical difficulties, right? That everything is documented, every interaction, every meeting, right? That's why we have minutes of council minute meetings, right? The bureaucracy documents everything to the best of its ability. And in the modern era, right, we saw, right, one of the things that we saw is there was a live stream of vote counting, right? This is part of bureaucracy, right? Poll workers are part of the bureaucracy. They don't enforce preference. They don't decide policy. They decide implementation. And one of the things they decided is we want to document every single thing, right? Vote counting has to be documented, right? We want to make sure that we have a free and fair election. That's very important to a democracy. And so every single interaction is documented. Every time you deal with a police officer, every time you deal with a DMV worker, every time you deal with anyone from our administration, right? Anyone in UNLV, because UNLV is a very large bureaucracy, has a very large bureaucracy, right? And is typically bureaucratically run, right? Every interaction should have an exchange, right? You should have a meeting, or you should have some sort of minutes, or you should have an email exchange, right? Every document that you have gives you power in a bureaucracy, right? And that's by design, right? That the more documents they have and the more of the paperwork that you've completed, the better your interactions will be. The last part is that bureaucracies are all about skilled professionals, right? The professionals work to a very specific skill set, right? They know how to do their job, right? And this is true of all bureaucracies, including police officers, and we'll talk about maybe a little bit of police officers' bureaucracy, right? The larger part, a huge part of a police officer's work is filling out paperwork, is documenting every interaction that occurred, right? I'm from California, so the rules might be different, but if a police officer unbuckles the buckle to his firearm, he has to write up a 3-page paper. There's not a 3-page paper, but there's a 3-page document that he has to fill out to explain why he unbuckled his gun from its holder, right? Not removed, because if he unbuckles it and then removes it, there's more paperwork, right? And every time a police officer takes his firearm out of the holster, right, that is paperwork that has to be done, because the police officer is a bureaucracy. But if they know how to do that paperwork, right, that's the expectation, is they do it over and over again. And on the other side, when you have much more bureaucratic, and the DMV is the best example I'm going to give you, because most of you have been to a DMV, have exchanged, right? Those are bureaucrats, right? They know how to do their job, right? And we'll talk about this incentive about how quickly or how dispassionately they do their job, but they seem very uninterested in you as a person. It's all about the paperwork and the process, right? It's about the processing of all the paperwork that they go through, right? The documentation that occurs, right? And so these are very skilled people. The other part is that there are norms to bureaucracy, right? Very specific norms, right? Merit-based promotion, right? The people who are best at the job should get promoted, right? And a system of knowledge and skill sets, right? Every DMV worker, every postal service worker, right? The post office is a much bigger bureaucracy, but humans don't have as much interaction. Americans don't have as much interaction with it today as they used to, right? But every single one of them took a test to prove that they could do that job, right? It's a meritocracy. Why do we care about bureaucracy if they're just doing what they're told, the policies and preferences of the elected officials? Because of implementation. So implementation is a very specific aspect where you try and take a law, and laws are typically quite vague, right? Sometimes one of the laws will say that right, I'll use the 3 strikes law because it's a little more clear, right? That if you have an individual with 3 felonies, the 3 strikes law that sort of applied in the 20th century and doesn't really, it's not universal anymore, right? If you get a 3rd felony, specifically some cases a violent felony, but if you get a 3rd felony, the minimum sentencing is life in prison, right? And so that is the law, right? But what constitutes a felony? How are these described as felonies, right? How do you implement that? And what does it mean to be in prison for the rest of your life, right? Does that mean that you can be released on compassionate release, right? If you're 85 and you're dying of cancer, can you be released on compassionate release? Or does the 3 strikes law allow that, right? Implementation is taking laws, which are typically quite vague, and finding the minutiae and translating them into the way that they will be ruled and the actions that will be taken. First, this requires specialized expertise, right? When it comes to criminal law that's passed by a legislative branch, you need criminal experts, you need criminologists, right? That's why we have advanced degrees in criminal justice, right? Those people are expected to understand how to take the law and turn it into actionable behavior, right? When it comes to tax plans, the IRS does this. When it comes to any law that's passed, right, it is up to the bureaucracy to figure out a way to implement it. And there will always be some vagueness in a law that is passed, just because of the nature of the legislative branch. Because of this, it gives what we call bureaucratic flexibility. And that allows the bureaucracy of different states, remember we're a federal system, so even if you have a law passed by Congress, it has to be enforced by the states, right? The local enforcement officers or police officers, highway patrol, those belong to the states and the local communities. And so they administer in ways that sort of take into account conditions that really only apply to specific areas, right? If you have someone who's overwatering here, right? If we say, okay, you're allowed to penalize individuals for excessive use of water, you might say excessive use of water is watering your lawn twice a week. That might be your idea of excessive in this condition because we care so much about water conservation. Whereas if you're from Colorado, excessive use of water might mean something very different, right? Those different conditions and that application of it. And I use that example because obviously Colorado and here water usage means very dramatic things to us, right? To us specifically because we live in a high plateau desert. So you have to have universal rules and you have to apply them to new conditions. So there's a specific process of rulemaking. And what happens is a new law is passed. And a new law doesn't really make it clear about how the implementation is going to work. So the first step is that you propose a set of rules, right? So you take a bureaucrat who is an expert in this, And they said, this is what the law, I think this is what the law is asking you to do, right? Because the law might be asking you to decrease violent crime. It might be asking you to decrease water usage. It might be asking you to promote renewable energy, right? Whatever it is, right, that, or it might, right, we just passed an initiative, right, that NBE has to get to 50% renewable in the next 10 years, right? So that just says we have to reach the 50%, right? How we reach it, is it going to be wind, solar, other factors, right? That is up to a bureaucrat. How do we actually implement this new law, right? And so I propose a set of rules, right? And what we'll likely see in Nevada is we'll see a lot more solar farms, right? The solar farms, as you go towards California, are very, very powerful, very useful. We get a lot of sunlight, very little rain. Solar power really works here, right? So I'm going to say we have to build X amount. We have to build 3 new solar farms, and that'll get us to 50% of the expected usage by 2030, right? And that'll put us at 50% renewable energy by 2030, which will match the law, right? You see, the law requires 50% by 2030. The implementation is building solar farms, right? That's how a bureaucrat works, right? And so that expectation is there. So they propose a set of rules, but the bureaucrat doesn't have any way to just say, these are the rules. They have to go and they have to add this to the Federal Register. And the Federal Register is all of the rules that exist for that organization, right? It is a quite expansive document. Most people don't know it. That's why you need experts and policy experts. Because if they propose a certain amount of rules and those rules violate pre-existing rules, then we have a problem, right? However, if they go to the Federal Register and they actually become the rules of that organization, then what we call the force of law, right? They are treated as part of the law, which means that if Nevada bureaucrats decide that solar power is the way to go rather than wind power, there will be more behavior that pushes us towards solar power, right? Regardless if that's the best case, right? That's where the policy bureaucrats will push it. And it gives it force of law. The other part, when you're doing like criminal justice or civil behavior, right? Bureaucrats have a lot of power when it comes to civil behavior. When we talk about like drunk driving, right? Bureaucrats decide the enforcement, the amount of enforcement that occurs on a drunk driver, right? They might say there's special conditions. They might say there's special cases, right? Whatever it is, right? It changes dramatically the behavior. And therefore, because it has that force of law, it influences the behavior of local enforcement officers, right? And other factors that treat people differently based on those rules, right? Everyone gets treated the same, but the way you're treated will change based on the rules. So it takes a long time to get a publication of the Federal Register, right? It can take up to 40 months. It takes a long time for bureaucrats to do anything because bureaucrats have a very specific rule set, right? And we talked about sometimes this is necessary, right? There is a big difference between expedited, the fastest way to get somewhere, and the most efficient way, right? What's the most efficient process? And so what the bureaucrats do more so than typically elected officials is before they propose any sort of rule changes, or when they propose any rule changes, they have what's called a public hearing, right? And you've seen these, and it's sort of dated now, but Parks and Recs used to do a satire version of this a lot. You put up a bunch of notices, however it goes out, paper or email, whatever, and you invite the town or the community to come in and speak their mind about a new proposal, right? And then the public comes in, and these individuals don't have to have any credentials. All they have to do is show up and they speak their mind. And you take all of their comments and you try to synthesize a belief of what the community wants, right? Because you're going to have some opposing views, right? So if you can figure out what the community wants, then that'll help you say, okay, this is the right way to approach this rule, right? This is the proper implementation, right? It's rule-based, but also it matches the community's needs. And that's what a bureaucrat has to balance. What does the community need, and what are the rules that exist? The other part is that bureaucrats will often require for most of their behavior an environmental impact statement, right? Every time you propose a new park, a new bridge, a new infrastructure, something's going to change. And one of the things is that we know that biodiversity helps our environment, right? Helps us survive. So we always try not to eliminate any species, right? This is why you have this sort of like joke about liberals in the late 90s about to save a slug, they would stop building a hospital, right? That some of these jokes are sort of dated now, but the reason they start coming about in the late 20th century is because there's this belief that if there is an endangered species that is in your park where you want some sort of new structure, then either there needs to be a relocation effort or you need to move the structure, right? Which can cost a lot of money, right? It's very costly for these things to happen. But an environmental impact statement also might include things like what's the change in the air quality, right? If you want to build something where you need to run a lot of furnaces, is that going to damage the air quality where it's not breathable for the local community? Are you going to be dumping into the water, right? Environmental impact statements are very, very useful to explain what is the larger impact over a longer time period, right? Not just what we care about right now, but what do we care about in 10 years, right? And as we know, going into the 20th century, right, there wasn't really this understanding of how we were changing our environment. And in the 70s and 80s, we first start understanding scientifically that our environment is being damaged by some of our behavior. And then later, as we get into the 21st century, in the last 10 to 20 years, it's really accepted by the scientific community that man-made climate change will impact us negatively, right? So I know that some of you might disagree politically, right? But all the science is there, right? That climate change is going to negatively impact us, right? And therefore we have to start planning for it ahead, right? There's a study that was produced maybe 10 years ago that said with the amount of oil that we know exists today, we can't burn it before we change the environment so much to where we can't live, right? So we can't actually use the remaining resources of oil and also live on this planet. And therefore there is sort of a scientific consensus that there has to be a shift, right? And so environmental impact studies become required much more so in the bureaucracy because they can say they don't have to say we're not going to do this. They say this is the impact, right? It doesn't change whether or not we do it. There just has to be rules-based decisions and documented behavior, right? Interactions have to be documented. So it doesn't mean that we're not going to choose the behavior. It just means we have to understand what the behavior is what's going to happen because of it, right? If you're going to build a plant, how is it going to impact the air? So one of the things is that law enforcement really sort of deals with this on a day-to-day basis because you have rules-based interactions, right? Interactions are documented, and everyone's treated the same based on the rules, right? The rules are the same for everybody. And this creates a couple of issues because you might have a case where the practice is not matching the law, right? So you have to treat these things individually. Right? We're going to treat the same rules. But what happens when you have someone who breaks a rule that you don't really know what to happen after you break the rule? And so in 2016, Volkswagen admitted that it had been cheating on emissions, right? That there were emissions caps, right? Most of you who have a car know that you have to get a smog check, right? There's a limit on the amount of emissions that your car can produce and still be allowed to drive on the road. Volkswagen had designed a device that allowed it to seem like it was emitting less than it was when it was going through smog checks in the United States, right? So it seemed like it was producing less pollution, and it was actually producing more. They admitted it was cheating, right? And they had been doing it for years, right? And so in response, there wasn't really a setup rule for that behavior. And so what the argument was, unless there was some behavior to offset, right, the US was going to say you can't sell Volkswagen in our system, right? We don't have a good way to check its pollutions, right? It's how much its emissions are, it's not pollutions, emissions, right? If we can't test its emissions properly, then we shouldn't be selling those in the United States, right? And so what ended up being this case is that the Volkswagen company settled, right, with the United States and produced some offsetting funds, right? This money, this 15 billion, 16 billion, is supposed to offset the pollution that was created from the vehicles. Whether or not that's actually where the money went, that's not really clear. But we do know that was the case in 2016. The other part is that often you will have a problem that a bureaucracy can solve that other organizations cannot. Most organizations deal with the now, right? When we talk about the CIA, even though it is a type of a bureaucracy, if you talk about the FBI, they're dealing with cases that are dealing with right now. Like law enforcement deals what's happening today, right? One of the things about bureaucracies is they can look forward and they can say, what are the issues we will face tomorrow, right? That's why you have sort of an active component and a bureaucratic component in a lot of organizations. And so in 1971, right, the United States military, its bureaucracy and scientific community, worked with the government to create this ARPANET or this intranet, right, in 1971, Advanced Research Projects Agency, right? This was an agency that existed that worked with the United States military, and its first goal was to sort of protect existing, right, communications in case of an attack, right? There was a belief, what if they block out our airwaves and we can't communicate, right? Because that's the last, right, in 1971, that was the way, right, this shortwave burst, or other radio communications that allowed units to communicate. And we needed another way to communicate in case that was knocked out. And so in 1971, they create this line of cables that connect to a few military bases, and they're able to communicate via computers. This becomes the sort of beginning of the internet created by a bureaucracy, right? Al Gore sometimes, there's sort of this joke about Al Gore taking credit. Al Gore worked with this project, but this project was going to happen through a bureaucracy. We need a new way to solve this problem. We think there's going to be a way for them to knock out communications. We need a new way. And in that process, right, the United States government, even though it was inevitable, we would have inevitably had the internet because of the way computers work, because of how beneficial the internet was, and we understood how beneficial that was, right? Eventually what happened, but it was the first version of the internet, we call the intranet, because it was not open access, right, was through the United States military. So bureaucracies are capable of solving problems in the future. They're capable of seeing a problem that can happen in the future and creating a solution, right? That's why the EPA is playing such a large role today. It's saying, no, yes, we're fine right now, but in 10, 20 years, the air will be so unbreathable that we'll still have masks on just for a different purpose, right? So when you have that, right, bureaucracies are very good at innovation because the individuals in those bureaucracies are specialized experts, right? They specialize in just that field, right? I am specialized in political science, and even more so, right, in conflict, right? Specifically in conflict has sort of been my specialty in the past, right? But I can only talk about those things. I can't talk about American history. I can't really talk about statistics. I know some, but I am not an expert. Specialized expertise, and that conglomeration of specialized expertise allows those individuals, right, to come up with solutions that most people could not see. So before 1883, bureaucrats were mostly patronage, right? If you got elected, you gave some jobs to the people that helped you get elected. But in 1883, they passed the Civil Service Act, right? And what the Civil Service Act did is it created a merit system. And what a merit system does is it introduces a couple of things. The first is that in the not at the very top, right? The very top will always be a political opponent, right? The cabinet members, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Education, those people will always be political appointees because you want them telling the organization what to do, right? You want to say, here are our interests, here are our preferences, here are our policies. But everyone below that is going to go to a system in which you have to have the qualifications for that position, right? The deputy director, the deputy secretary of education typically has somewhat sort of education degree, an EDD, a doctorate in education, right? The people in that group right below the executive cabinet, right? They are very educated in policy. They've been working at the Department of Education or similar aspects for many years, right? So a merit system really makes sure that people in certain offices have high levels of education and qualification, right? The post office, the Foreign Service Bureau, if you want to be a foreign service operative or a postal clerk or work at the DMV, you will have to pass a test to prove that you are capable of doing it. And the more the expertise is expected, the harder the test is to pass, right? The Postal Service test is hard, but it's not that hard, right? And then the harder test is going to the DMV. And if you want to be an FSO, a Foreign Service Officer, right, then you have to have a very high level of testing, right? And the testing gets more difficult to make sure the people in those offices have the necessary expertise. At the high levels, you do have part of the political appointees, and they do not have to be part of the merit system, right? President George W. Bush appointed an individual in charge of a department of, I want to say housing or traffic, right? He appointed someone to an organization, and their only experience ever in their life, professional experience, was running an Arabian horse racing league. That was the only experience they had, right? Which is fine as a civilian if that's your expertise is horse racing, but that doesn't really apply to any sort of high-level cabinet position in the United States government. So that person was not qualified. And we don't expect that because they're not part of the merit system, right? Those are people that the president trusts in order to fulfill policies that they prefer. After this service, you had to have this cleansing aspect, right? You had to have political interference removed. And this is part of a bureaucracy, is that you start to eliminate more and more interference from the political aspects. Why is it that Dr. Fauci can talk about COVID in a specific way that doesn't really match the President Trump's language? Is because of this bureaucratic insulation, right? It's bureaucratic insulation because he's expected to be an expert. Dr. Fauci is expected to be an expert first, right? He's an expert first. And so that allows him some insulation. The other part is because they're not political appointees, we expect them to be much better at their job, right? Dr. Fauci clearly knows more about infectious disease than any person who is elected to office, high levels of office, right? That he is the expert when it comes to these things. Okay. So one of the things about federal service, and when it comes to federal bureaucracy, is that it shrinks dramatically over time. And we should expect this. This is not a policy-driven thing. So in 1968, this is the peak of federal service. There are 3.6 million military personnel and 3 million civilian employees. In 2014, right, and it's probably even lower now, you only had 1.5 million military personnel and 2.7. So you had a small decrease in civilian employees. One of the reasons is that civilian bureaucrats want to keep their job forever, right? So it's much harder to eliminate a civilian bureaucratic position. It is much easier to eliminate military positions because there is less push to keep that job, and because basically soldiers, right, even if if they do a military career, it's about 20 years. So most service members are in their late 30s, 40s, maybe into their 50s when they're done. So you have a faster turnover. And so what you do is you start eliminating positions. This is not policy driven. We don't believe it to be policy driven in large part because we know why there are fewer personnel in some of these cases, right? Why are there less military personnel? One is that you have the invention of the ATM, right, and other payroll service and banking services. It used to be that you had to have these very large finance offices that had to pay every single individual or provide them with a check, right, every 2 weeks, every month, right? That's why it used to be a monthly pay system in the military, right? So you had to have all of the setup to print these checks. Once you change that to an online banking system where the government just direct deposits your funds into your account, it requires fewer and fewer people to be in those offices, right? That's finance, but also logistics and bureaucracy, right? All of those things have fewer personnel requirements because you can eliminate a number of people by having a computer system, right? So between 1968, we have computers and then the internet. So of course the military is going to shrink. And why is it shrinking more than the civilian component? Because civilians want to keep their jobs. They're going to fight to maintain the size of the bureaucracy. You never want to give a position at your bureaucracy. Specifically, certain bureaucracies like the CIA, the FBI, any military component, because that means your budget's going to shrink. And you want to be as large as possible so you can take up as many tasks as possible, right? There is a competition among bureaucracies to be the largest and take up the most responsibility, right? The Army always wants to be larger than the Navy because they're competing of whose responsibility is what. They both want to take over certain tasks. Why does the United States Army still have aircraft, right? Combat aircraft? Why does it still have an A-10? Why does it still have many of these aspects? Because it wants to hold those roles. Bureaucracies have an inherent desire to continue to grow, right? So civilian bureaucracies are harder to shrink. Now, on the other end of this, state and local bureaucracies have just exploded, right? In 1950, they're at 4.3 million, and then in 2015, they're at 4.3 million in 1950. In 2015, they're at 19.3 million. Why are they expanding so dramatically? Because local communities have more jobs now, right? Even though they don't have to do as much, right? The efficiency is much better. You have a lot of jobs that governments didn't do in the 1950s, right? You have environmental studies, right? You have a lot more of a legal practice when it comes to behavior, right? You have researchers, you have an entire team of researchers at CCSD, right? The Clark County School District, one of my colleagues works there as a researcher. That was not an aspect that used to exist. Schools didn't have a lot of this bureaucracy in the past. And as I talked about, bureaucracies want to expand. They want to take over more rules, right? In California, state education, K through 12 education, took over preschool when Head Start collapsed through bankruptcy of private organization, federally funded, but private organization, Head Start. It collapsed. Schools want to take over because they want to take up that funding, right? You want to take preschool funding in, right? So you have to expand to take in preschool. So bureaucracies naturally have a desire to expand. The recession we don't really have enough information about this year for me to talk about it academically. So I'm still talking about the recession. I know that Now it's very dated because this is going to be the thing that we talk about. Once we get our next textbook, it's going to be pandemic driven, right? That understanding how the pandemic changed our lives will be a big part of this course moving forward once the next edition comes out. But it'll probably be 2022 by the time we really understand what happened, right? We know that how many people died and got sick, but as far as like how it changed our economy and our society, that's still not very clear, right? The permanence of it isn't very clear, right? There are some things that, right, hopefully in the next few years, you will live in a society where you can sort of just not wear a mask and not be as worried about social distancing. But there are some things that'll never go back to normal, right? We may always have smaller class sizes. We may always be different. There might always be plexiglass everywhere, right? There might be constant testing and disease tracing in the United States after this, right? So we don't have enough, so we have to talk about the recession because we don't have enough information about the pandemic today. For me to approach it academically, right? We can sort of speculate, but speculation is not something I want to do in this class. So what happened in 2009 is you had a recession. You had two components, right? I want to say three because I want to separate the wars, but they're really one component, right? You have the recession. So the costs, right? Unemployment, right, is costing the United States a lot more money, right? A lot more services are being asked for by the population, right? They're more so, which is similar to today, right? That you have a lot more people asking for services than not during a pandemic or recession. And then also the cost of war, right? In the range of at least $1 trillion for Iraq and Afghanistan wars, right? And between those two things, what you have is a lot more people asking for services and a lot less money and taxes coming in. And so what happens is you have to save money somewhere, right? You can stimulus spend a little, right? You can send out stimulus to those individuals, but the government has to find a way to save money. The government always has to try and find some way to save money. And so the first part is in 2009, you have a forced decline in the federal bureaucracy. And one of the ways that they do this is they say, states, this is your problem, right? Also, why do states' bureaucracies go up as federal go up? Some of the problems, right, as Reagan starts pushing through in the 80s and then becomes more and more prominent in the 21st century, states start giving them a lot more autonomy. It's your problem, you deal with it. Also, we're not going to pay for it, right? So that pushes a lot of the bureaucracy to the lower level. The other thing is we start going from services provided to individuals to direct payments, right? This is something that really is a 21st century sort of shift, that now we are much more likely to provide you with resources, we are much more likely to provide you with some sort of financial support than resource support, right? Social Security, Medicare, right? These are payments in to those things, right? Now, Medicare, actually, they buy you insurance, so it's a little mixed bag, right? But EBT systems, right? They're no longer, we're going to provide you food, right? There's food that you can pick at the store. Now we're going to provide you a certain amount of money, and you can spend that money how you choose, right? Less bureaucracy and more freedom for those individuals to use those things, right? The quality of EBT, which when I say EBT, I mean something like food stamps or like food cost programs where the government gives you a certain amount to pay for food, right? A lot of those cards can now be used at fast food. And what we're likely going to see is the quality of the food that people eat who are on these programs is going to decline. Instead of eating grocery store food, which can still be quite bad for you, they're going to start eating fast food, which is at least slightly worse than grocery store food, right? That there is a difference, right? So what we're going to see is more and more freedom for those individuals to do what they want with the money they get from the government, but a lower quality because the easier access behaviors are lower quality, right? And I don't mean anything by fast food like that should not be a controversial statement. I hope it's not, right? But fast food is of lower quality and will make you in worse health than a grocery store, right? That shouldn't be a controversial statement. Okay, so we know that it's rules-based, it's an organization, it's offices and desks. So let's talk about the specific organization, right? You have a department, the Department of Education, the Department of Transportation, Housing, right? These are the top level. There are 15 departments that make up the cabinet or did make up the cabinet for the president, right? The president picks a secretary of each one of these departments. In each one of these, they have what's called an undersecretary. The undersecretaries or whatever term is given to these individuals is the next tier. So at the very top is the executive, and then all of the departments that the executive is directly connected to, and then you start getting to all the agencies, right? The Secretary of Defense is a department, right? The Department of Defense. But then the Secretary of the Army, the Secretary of the Navy, each of those secretaries are more specifically tied to a specific agency, right? Now, it's still a bureaucratic organization, but bureaucratic organizations can also be military organizations, right? Intelligence organizations. After you get to that point, these individuals are directing large agencies, then you get to the bureau level. And the bureau level operates, right, based on rules, right? Congress has to create these bureaus. And some of these are very specific, but also, because they're created by statute, have clear limitations. The Forest Service should be obvious, right? It's Forest Service management, right? Making sure that we clear out our growth, right? We know today, right, that you have to sort of clear out or control burns to limit how many wildfires are, right? California is very versed in this. They do it very poorly, which is why they have so many wildfires. Also, dry communities and people living in those dry communities is a problem. But, right, how do we manage these services? How do we maximize the amount of oxygen output in our forests in smaller areas, right? How do we make dense forests which won't catch on fire? And then, of course, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is a really clear example of local law enforcement were not really capable of handling people who cross state lines regularly, right? It used to be that police officers would not cross the state line, right? Sometimes there's exceptions now, but for the most part, if you commit a crime in Ohio and you drive across a few states into Utah, or you drive into Nevada and you come here, the officers, right, the warrants that you have in the other state, they're not going to be really applied in the past, right? Remember, this is before sort of modern technology, and extradition is a lot easier today. And there are some criminals who are so violent and traveling so quickly that you need a federal organization. And so the Federal Bureau of Investigation really comes about responding to criminals who are a specific type that aren't really going to be easily controlled by local law enforcement. And because of that, we have very specific rules for the Federal Bureau, right? One of the things that may not hold true today, but is expected to hold true by the statutes. Remember, these are created by statutes, rules-based created organizations of Congress. So one of the things is the FBI is not supposed to operate on foreign soil. The FBI is the domestic sphere, right? It only deals with things that happen inside the United States. Now, it might be worried about threats to the United States, which creates some ambiguity, but the CIA is supposed to deal with things that are not in the United States, right? The CIA is supposed to handle foreign threats, and the FBI is supposed to handle domestic threats, right? And then because this is by statute, right, their behavior is very different. But obviously, you have to sort of coordinate and work together, right? So the lines are blurred, but there are lines there that sort of say what each service should do, right? The Forest Service is not water management. It does not handle water management. Each one of these is limited in their scope. And if they try to go beyond their scope, is the expectation of other organizations and elected officials to keep them within their scope. Right, independent agencies, right? The reason a few of these are not part of a cabinet department, the CIA is insulated. We actually talked about the CIA a few weeks ago. I don't know if you remember, but there's this idea of plausible deniability. It's actually a weird line from Independence Day, which is a very old movie now. But right, this argument that the president isn't kept informed about everything the CIA does intentionally, right? And so it's more independent. And then NASA is automatically independent because people really don't understand the mechanics of what NASA is doing, right? The research, this is a clear bureaucracy that requires incredible expertise, right? There is no more concentration of expertise than in NASA, because people's utility is based on their expertise, right? The more that they know, the more useful they are to the organization. And if you had a political appointee, it's not that they wouldn't really understand, it's not that they wouldn't be able to say what the policies were, it's that they wouldn't understand whether or not their policies were being enacted. Right, so hold on one second. I'm gonna check something real quick. I don't know if I discuss it. I am skipping ahead a little bit, but I just want to make sure I don't discuss this too early. Did you talk about that? Okay, I'll just talk about it now. So bureaucracies create this thing called the principal agent dilemma, right? and by principle, PAL, not principles like they have values, but principle, like the principle is the American government, right? They're the one who sets the policies, and the agent is the bureaucracy. So the thing about NASA, why does it not have direct control, is because of this principal agent dilemma. You may want something to happen, right? I am a bureaucrat, right? You may want to interact with me, right? Say that you're essentially my constituents, right? You decide my keeping this job, right? So you want me to behave very differently, right? You say, oh, I want you to do this square and send the material better. You're gonna tell me what you want, and I'm gonna tell you, well, this is the only way to do it. And what I can do as a bureaucrat is do it the way that I want to do it and make it seem like I'm doing it your way. That's the principal agent dilemma, right? Or the principal agent problem, depending on the literature you're reading, right? That because you have these very specialized expertise in NASA, right? Elected officials don't know how astrophysics works. They don't know how physics works. They don't know how rockets take off. They don't know the cost of the materials. They don't know if certain materials are better than other materials. They don't know those factors, and it's very difficult for them to understand. And this creates a lot of leeway. We talked about already bureaucratic flexibility because the individuals, elected individuals, don't really understand it as well. And there's a lot of opportunity for bureaucrats to say that one thing is necessary when it's what they want. And it's very hard for people to tell the difference, right? If I tell you as a bureaucrat, as an instructor, that you have to do certain things to succeed, you're going to believe me because I am treated as the expert in this classroom, right? I'm going to say, oh, you have to take these practice quizzes to do well on the test, right? You're incentivized to believe me because I'm the one who wrote the text, right? That's a thing, right? But if you studied the text and you read all the material and you lived in the United States your entire life, you may not need those practice quizzes, right? Those are factors that allow for that principal agent problem. Okay, so that occurs a lot more in independent agencies. Independent agencies are independent in large part because they have to be. They cover a certain aspect. The next part is a government corporation. And a government corporation behaves in a very specific way. The most obvious example is the United States Postal Service. It's market-oriented. What does that mean? It means that it's selling a product, right? The United States Postal Service sells transportation. It sells shipping, right? It works the same way that FedEx or UPS does. It works the same way, right? So you go to the Postal Service, you pay them to ship your package, it gets shipped, right? The reason why it's set up that way is because they're trying to provide a public service, right? A public service that's self-funded by the service itself, right? Amtrak has to pay itself through, Amtrak is it doesn't exist here, but it exists sort of the East Coast, West Coast. It's trains and other behaviors, and you buy a ticket, and that's how it's funded. It's funded by its own ticket sales. The Postal Service is funded by package and stamp sales. So one of the things about these government corporations is that they have to raise revenue to fund themselves. The Postal Service pays for itself. If it doesn't pay for itself, and this is true of all government corporations, it has to borrow from the United States government. So the Postal Service can borrow from the United States government. But if it borrows, it has to pay everything back. It has to pay back every dollar with interest, right? It takes an interested loan, right? It takes a loan with interest from the United States government. So when the Postal Service doesn't really make enough money, yes, it borrows from the United States government, but the United States government makes money off the interest of that loan, and eventually that loan is paid back, right? The other part is if government corporations make more money than it costs to run, they have to give that excess, any profits that a government corporation makes, they have to give that to the government. So whenever the Postal Service has a profit, it gives it to the general pool of the United States Congress for it to spend. And whenever it has a deficit, it has to borrow and then pay back those loans, right? It is the worst possible business model we could have if it were trying to be profitable. It is the best case scenario, right, for a American system, right? Because when people talk about privatizing the post office doesn't actually cost the taxpayer anything. If you never ship something or buy a stamp, if you don't ship anything to the post office or buy a stamp, you did not put any of your money into that system, right? And so it's not taxpayer funded, it's sales funded, it's market oriented. And because of that, right, it allows that if we have a reduction in services, right, it doesn't really impact the Postal Service. You also have independent regulatory commissions. These really deal with very specific things. They are independent for different reasons. they require full-time attention and they require expertise. We actually saw the Federal Election Commission work overtime in this election, right? They had to make sure that counting was very clear. They came out several times and made it clear that there was no credibility to accusations of voter fraud or widespread voter fraud, right? To be very clear, there will always be a few dozen people who manage to vote twice or go and vote twice in two different places. There will always be, right? We had 144 million people vote. If we have 100 people who committed voter fraud, that's such a small number, right? We still are going to prosecute. That's the thing, it's a felony. So those people will be prosecuted, but it won't change the outcome of the election. There's no credibility. So the Federal Election Commission makes sure everyone votes only once, make sure they're qualified to vote, make sure they're voting where they actually live, right? And make sure that there's no way for it to be influenced outside of the domestic sphere, right? Only the people who voted should have an influence in the outcome, right? So the Federal Election Commission has been really working. They have not found any sort of widespread issues. They have been providing a great deal of transparency, right? As much as there are questions about other things that are going to be happening in the next few months, right, there is no question that we have free and fair elections. And this is very important because democracy, at its bare minimum, has to have free and fair elections. The reason it's independent is very obvious as well, right? You do not want the incumbents to have an influence over the Federal Election Commission, right? The people who are in power shouldn't have control over the way the election works, right? The election bureaucracy should be independent. And when you have that level of expertise, even when the elected officials try to influence, they don't know enough to know whether or not the bureaucrats are listening to them, right? One of the benefits of the principal agent problem is that it can't be influenced by outside elected officials, right? They don't know how to influence because that insulation occurs through expertise, right? You might have trouble telling, if you have 4 classes a semester, you might have trouble telling, I mean, I might be the worst, I don't know, but you might have trouble telling which one of your professors is doing a better job, right? Sometimes that's not clear which one of us is being harder, which one is too easy, or which one is more, because, right, that lack of expertise, because most of you have not been instructors in the past, right, it's difficult to tell where that line is, right? So there can be benefits because I can say, this is what I expect you to do for the best learning outcome, and you sort of have to believe me. So that's independent regulatory commissions. So we talked about organization. We talked about these underlying principles, right? You have to have a meritocracy, right? Expertise and principles and norms of that, right? You have to have rules-based decisions, right? Everyone is treated the same under the rules, and the rules apply to everyone, right? There are no exceptions, right? I mean, there are exceptions, but people are treated based on what they need, not based on their backgrounds, right? Not based on their ethnicity or their race or their religion or other factors. So the first of those 3 main goals is to provide services and products, right? That, remember, the bureaucrats don't decide to be conservative or liberal, right? Their job is to, how do I take what I have, like the resources that I have, and provide it to the most amount of people or promote public welfare at the highest level, right? How do I provide the greatest amount of support to the public that I possibly can, right? If you work in a welfare agency, and I don't mean that stigmatized, I just mean any agency which tries to make other people's lives better, right? Your job is to try and get as many people in that program as possible and provide them as much resources as possible. That's part of your job, right? That, how do I make public welfare better? A separate goal is national security. Now, obviously, these have to be separate because national security can only focus on national security, right? How do I make sure that the public is defended from harm without violating their rights? Now, this is one of those things about national security that's very complicated. It would be much easier to protect you if I could just read all your emails, listen to all your phone calls, right, track all your movements. It would be easier to protect you, right, your physical body. But in that case, I would be violating your rights, right? And so we have to find a balance in national security. How do I make sure that I don't violate your rights and keep your physical body from harm and keep your interest from harm, right? I have to keep your bank account safe. I have to keep, right, the national interest harm, right? What's the national interest that exists? I have to protect those as well. And then the third one, right, is how do I keep a strong economy? And so if you look at these might conflict, right? National security, strong economy, and public welfare, they are not easily balanced goals, right? And we talked about this in the very beginning, right? You have liberty and equality. those things are hard to balance, right? Because sometimes more liberty means less equality, and sometimes more equality means less liberty. So trying to balance these two goals is problematic, but we will approach them each individually in different points, right? So when we talk about public welfare, oh, come on. We used to talk about temporary assistance for needy families, right? I think this is still the program, and this National Institute of Health. So temporary assistance is food stamps, it is other direct support, it's SSI, right? It's the intention that what I'm gonna do is when you need direct help, I'm going to find some resources, I'm gonna give you some funds, and they're gonna be temporary, because the goal in the United States is very different than in other cases. Every government service that you receive is expected to be temporary. I'm going to help you, right, get to a point where you don't need my help. That's always the goal in the United States when it comes to public welfare, right? If I provide you unemployment, right, money, that's supposed to give you time, right, to go and find another good job, right? That's part of the reason why unemployment works the way that it does, right? When you first get unemployed, make sure you don't immediately lose your home and you can feed yourself. But then also give you a couple of weeks or a couple of months to find a new job, right? We're in a pandemic right now, so obviously things are a little off, right? But unemployment has typically worked when you lose your job, as long as you don't quit or you weren't fired under some sort of criminal expectation, right? Then you get unemployment. And you go on unemployment and you go look for work. And this should give you a few more weeks to find a job where your quality of life isn't dramatically diminished because of the new job you take, right? You should give in time to find a comparable job. Because what we found is when we don't give you time to find a comparable job, you take the first job that comes up. And that's usually a worse job. And then you make less money, and then you pay less in taxes, and we're worse off because of it. You're worse off and we're worse off, right? So that's how employment temporary assistance. The other part is this National Institute of Health, right? This is Medicare and Medicaid. This is dramatically different. I don't think this is going to come up. One of the reasons why Medicare and Medicaid really come up in the National Institute of Health is because we learned that if we don't take care of you, you become, instead of taking care of you, right, in Medicare and Medicaid, typically for older people, very poor people, then either the cost of your insurance is so high that you don't get care and you will die, or, right, that you will go back to work, right? This is one of the things that the United States has a problem with that other places don't, is you'll go to work sick, right? Americans typically, before this pandemic, would often go to work sick because they had a different system. And so some of this National Institute of Health was saying, well, if you go to work sick, then you're going to get all of your coworkers sick, right? And then when all of your coworkers are sick, even though people will still show up, their productivity will be down, and that means that we'll lose money, right? And so one of the things is that it was cheaper to start providing some of these things than to let everyone just be sick, right? Some of this is tied to that economic aspect. So it doesn't always have to be in contest, but it often can be. In these public work, I think this should be before this. When we talk about a regulatory agency, regulatory agencies do deal with public welfare, but they do it in very specific ways. Instead of me helping you, an individual, I try to make things better for everyone in that community. So one of the things that regulatory agencies might do is put limits on how much pollutants can be in the water to make sure the water is safe to drink, right? Or what we see, I don't think this is a thing in Las Vegas, but it's pretty common on the West Coast, is sort of burn days. When is it okay for you to burn in a fireplace? When is it okay for you to use your fireplace, right? And you have an entire agency that says, okay, only on certain days when the air quality is not so bad, can you run your fireplace? That way, we only have fireplaces on days that aren't already so bad. So we don't get very, very polluted air, right? It's still quite breathable. So those help promote public health by limiting how often you can use your fireplace, right? Now that's an invasion of your sort of home and not an invasion, but that limits what you can do in your own home, right? You can't run your fireplace whenever you feel like it, but it also helps promote public health, right? The air quality is better by limiting what people can do in those situations. We see this mostly on companies. Regulatory agencies really apply to companies more than it does to individuals, right? How much can they dump? How much can they use? How much power can they use, right? How many liquor licenses are handed out, right? You don't want every single store to have a liquor license, right? You want to have some tampers on the consumption of alcohol and where it occurs, because then you can have more responsibility on those individuals, right? Bars have high penalties for allowing someone to leave their establishment drunk and drive home. There can be a penalty associated with the bar, right? When you talk about an Applebee's, that's highly unlikely, right? Because it does serve alcohol, but it also serves food, right? They don't really as typically control whether or not they find if someone leaves their establishment under the influence, right? So these behaviors are very different. Regulatory agencies use that to try and promote public health. You also have bureaucracies with very, very specific clientele. I used to talk about the VA a lot more because the VA had a lot of problems in the past, but right, you're the clientele for the Department of Education. You're the clientele, right? Yes, you are students of a higher learning education system, right? That you are students at UNLV, right? The Department of Education has really changed the way that you behave, right? The interest rates on your loans are higher, the Pell Grants don't cover as much, tuition is much higher, right? So you are directly connected. You are the direct clientele of that organization. And so that organization has typically in the past responded to you, right? If students start demanding lower tuition, they start demanding behavior. Why? Because you're the clientele, which means that if in large swaths you stop paying tuition or you stop going to this university, right, then there's an economic problem. And if that's in multiple universities across the state or across the country, right, then the Department of Education has a problem where there's no new money coming into the system, right? And we have, right, over $1 trillion in student loan debt, right? That has to be serviced, has to be processed. They require funding, right? So as clientele, you do have a lot of power with the Department of Education. Because soldiers and ex-military work with the Veterans Affairs behavior, that's their clientele, right? Ex-military is Veterans Affairs. You as students are the clientele of the Department of Education. The VA is an iron triangle. We actually already talked about iron triangles in the past, right? The Department of Affairs is the agency, right? Congress, the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and the Armed Services Committee are tied to, well, the Veterans Affairs Committee very specifically is tied to this iron triangle. And in interest group, you have the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign War, the VFW. So this interest group, this Congress, this congressional committee, and this agency, they work together. They're very stable. You don't see new interest groups influencing this behavior, right? The VFW and the American Legion are really the only two interest groups that matter when it comes to this issue. There is only one committee that really covers this, and there's only one agency that covers this, right? So the three components are stable. They work together consistently. The other part is they're very insulated, right? If you are a different interest group, it will be very difficult for you to get time to speak at these committee meetings, at the House Affairs Committee meeting. It will be very difficult for you to work with the agency, the Department of the VA, right? Because the Department of Veteran Affairs and the House Veterans Affairs Committee are so tight-knit, right? If you're not one of those two interest groups, you're not going to have a lot of leeway in communicating that system. And so there's going to be very little change over time. This is also why it was very slow to adopt new technology, because there weren't any new groups sort of demanding that behavior, right? The VFW has not really pushed the VA for high levels of technological advancement. That's not part of the VFW's pursuit. It was not. There have been some shifts lately, but it was not in the past. All right. So that was a description of that iron triangle. I already asked you about iron triangle, so I probably won't ask you about it again, but I do want you to understand this idea of public welfare and what it means to be a bureaucracy with clientele. Let's move on to providing national security. So I was in the Army. I'm not really telling you, sir. We have a little bit of time, but I'm not really telling you, sir. I was in the Army in 2000. I joined the Army in 2000. I'm using my perspective to explain. I'm not trying to tell you my life story. In 2001, I was a Korean linguist. That was my job in the Army, right? In 2001, I was a Korean linguist in the Army. After September 11, 2001, it became very clear, a couple of things became very clear. One, we didn't need Korean linguists, we needed Arabic linguists, right? So once I finished my Korean linguist training, I went and worked on other missions. I never worked as a Korean linguist in the Army, right? I was trained, but I didn't work, right? One shift. The other was that the way we were doing that was insulated, right? The way that we were behaving was the CIA wasn't communicating with the Army wasn't communicating with the other branches, right? Each component was there to prevent 9/11, but we weren't communicating. And so what happened is you created the Department of Homeland Security. It was created specifically to prevent terrorism. Homeland Security deals with terrorism issues. What happens is the National Security Council and all those stopped dealing with crimes, right? It used to be that national security involved violent crime, right? Preventing bombings, preventing domestic attacks. There's a dramatic shift. One of the reasons why we see, one of the many reasons, right? Not sort of a big reason, but one of the smaller reasons in a very large picture of reasons that we saw more school shootings before this pandemic was because the national security apparatus stopped looking at those individuals, right? It used to be the case in the late 90s that if individuals seemed like they were going to shoot up a school, that there would be contact and then some sort of federal agency would step in and start doing some investigation, right? That doesn't happen as much because terrorism is the focus. So we move away from crimes towards terrorism after 2001, right? It changes the way that national security is looked at, right? It's much more concerned with external threats and much less concerned with domestic threats, right? And because we're so concerned about external threats, right, we start talking about the roles in which external threats can be covered, right? The first is the Department of State. Those of you who become political science majors will get a lot more about diplomacy. It's not really something that we can get into in a 101 class, right? But the Department of State deals with diplomacy. How do you respond diplomatically? How do you deal with individuals, right, so that they don't try to pursue a violent course of action, right? So the Department of State and the Secretary of State are really trying to prevent conflict wherever they can. They're trying to use diplomatic solutions. That can include military assistance funding, right? You can say, all right, don't go here, right? Don't go to war with this other state, and we'll provide you defense. Or we're going to go to a security alliance, so you don't have to feel threatened by that other state. So you won't build up an arms race, right? So a lot of these diplomatic solutions prevent conflict. That's their job, is to try and prevent conflict. Once you have a conflict existing or the need for a military response, then it shifts into the Department of Defense, right? And the Department of Defense does not deal with diplomatic solutions. When the Department of Defense is involved, right, it's a strike behavior, right? How do I eliminate threats? And what we see in the 21st century is a move away from diplomacy and a move towards what we call preemptive strikes, right? The Department of Defense starts saying there's going to be a threat eventually here, right? This became some of the training camps in the Afghanistan war, right? That these training camps are training terrorists. They haven't done anything wrong yet, but they are training individuals that will later be capable of committing attacks on the United States. So you start blowing up these training camps and the individuals in those training camps as a preemptive strike. So the behavior of national security changes dramatically after 2001. You start looking at preemptive strikes more, right? How do I eliminate? You have drones, you have a technological advancement in drones, and so you start taking out targets before they can become threats, right? Why did the Trump administration take out Iranian general, right? Why do you have drone strikes in Yemen, even though Yemen is not a threat by the Obama administration? Because preemptive strikes become a huge part of the strategy of national defense, right? National security becomes preemptive strikes, and the focus turns towards external threats. Okay, so here we run into this problem that I talked about between national security and democracy. I already talked about this trade-off between personal rights, protecting the general public. You all of you know this, right? All of you understand this now because of social media, because of so many factors. You have so much public information that your private life is not as private as it used to be. I probably could know most things about any one of you by simply finding your social media accounts, right? Very easily, and there's no guarantee of privacy. Even if you call them private, they're only private in the sense that only your friends and people that you invite can join them. But because they're part of the social media, the government doesn't have to get a warrant to look at them, right? They can just open up all your accounts, right? So parts of your life are very, very public, right? So we're not violating those. But the parts that you want to keep private, that you're not sharing with social media, you want much more intensely than in the past to keep private. This is one of those things that has become very clear in the last 10 years. You share so much, right? And I don't mean you as a young people. I mean us as Americans. I don't have social media accounts. I very rarely share. But most Americans share dramatically on social media. But because they choose what they share and what they don't share, The things that they don't share, they treat as very intensely private and feel that those should not be violated, right? So it creates a different behavior for the national security apparatus to have that trade-off. You really don't want some information some of the information you really want to remain private, and you very intensely feel about that, and you will react to it being not private, right? And so it creates this trade-off that is very difficult. The other part is that the government needs secrecy to do certain things, right? It requires secrecy for invasion plans, right? The United States, the public should not know the base movements, the troop movements, right? Where certain secret agents are, where certain individuals who are committing certain acts are, right? Certain people need to have secrecy in order to do their job. But we live in the United States and we have the Freedom of Information Act, which means that the public has a right to know what the government is doing. And so there's always this trade-off. And usually what happens is we do about usually about a 10-year timeline, right? We know now about Operation Paperclip, right? We know that after World War II, that the United States took Nazi scientists and brought them into the United States to work, right? And like Livermore Labs in California, right? And labs on the East Coast, right? Brought them into think tanks. We took a lot of scientists who were part of the Nazi Party, and there was a rule that they could not be part of the Nazi Party, and we still brought them into the United States to work as scientists, right? Now, we know that today, we did not know that until about 1965, 1970, right? 10, 20 years later, right? So usually with that second trade-off is a timeline, eventually. We saw some breakdowns of this sort of trade-off where we went much more on the security side. In World War II, we had Japanese internment camps. If you had Japanese descent, you were put in a camp, right? Internment camps are very problematic. They were a very problematic part of the 20th century. It was very inappropriate to put these people in because they hadn't shown any dedication to the Japanese Empire. They hadn't done anything wrong, right? This was essentially false imprisonment. That's why they were internment camps and not prisons, right? And what we saw was that violation of their rights because security became more important to the American public. You see not the same thing, but a very similar thing happened in the Patriot Act, right? The Patriot Act allowed for warrantless wiretapping, which means I didn't have to get a warrant to break into all of your communications. And because of that warrants court, because of that behavior, your privacy was not respected as much during that period of time. So not nearly as extreme, right? I don't want to have some sort of false comparison, right? Treating things the same when they're not. But you have internment camps, you have the Patriot Act. But in 1966, right, the Congress passed the Freedom of Information Act. And this is why we always have this back and forth, is that Congress said the American people can always petition for information, and the government has to provide that information or say that information is not being provided for national security reasons. And this gave the government a lot of transparency because it had to either claim it was national security or provide the information. And when you have to do that, sometimes you can provide information in any response, right? If you say, no, this is part of national security, I'm not going to give you the answer, that also allows those individuals to know that what is happening, right? Gives them certain information. In the last few years, right, we saw that there's a national security archive, right? The sort of Snowden case that we were tracking who you called and for how many minutes you called those numbers in very large databases, right? That was a very problematic issue. We were tracking your calls, just not what was in them, and we don't have to have a warrant to track what numbers you call, only the actual words that you're communicating through those things, right? So we can track every phone call in its duration, just not what was said, right? And so that sort of creates this problematic limit. And then this idea of a torture archive, this is a private organization that keeps track of what individuals were tortured and how. The word torture is very problematic, right? The Supreme Court said enhanced interrogation was not torture. So sometimes when we talk about things like waterboarding or, I hate this language, but sort of water torture, right? Where they hold your hands above your head and they drip freezing cold water on you in a cold environment for hours on end, right? That was considered enhanced interrogation. It was not considered torture, and therefore it's not torture. But this archive calls it torture, and it provides all the information to those people who went through those activities, right? Legally, waterboarding and other types of enhanced interrogation are not torture according to the Supreme Court, right? That's the whole point, right? You know about them, we tell people about them, but they are not legally called torture because you cannot torture in the United States. There are laws against torture in the United States. Specifically, the Eighth Amendment that says you can't use cruel and unusual punishment, right? And torture is by definition cruel. Therefore, the Eighth Amendment doesn't allow you to commit cruel and unusual punishment on individuals. So if it were to be called torture by the Supreme Court, then it wouldn't be allowed in the intelligence apparatus of the National Security Council, or it wouldn't be allowed to use to defend national security. So the last goal is maintaining a strong economy. And this one is, compared to the other two, it can be much more complicated. And there can be competing ideas. So there's this idea of fiscal policy. And when I talk about fiscal policy, I just mean taxing and spending, right? Fiscal policy is how much should we tax and how much we should spend to change the economy. And one of the things that we know is if you tax too much, the economy will get worse. And if you spend more, the economy will get better, right? So one of the things about fiscal policy is that the lower the taxes are and the more that you spend, the better the economy will be. The problem with that is how are you going to spend more money if you're taxing less, right? So fiscal policy becomes very complicated. You need taxes to produce enough resources to provide for the spending necessary, right? But not too high. And a couple of other things, right? There's also monetary policy, right? This is banks, credit, and currency. One of the things that used to be very prominent in the 90s that because of terrorism and because of, right, election politics and partisan behavior in the United States, it's not as important, is this Federal Reserve System. And so monetary policy is controlled by the Federal Reserve System. And this is just a number of banks that work together, and they regulate not just the banking system, but also how much money is in the system, how many dollars are in the currency, right? That's why you see new money printed up, right? One is to fight counterfeiters, and the other is you start to eliminate worn down dollars, and you want to control how much money is in the system, right? If there's too much money in the system, then the money itself is worth less. If there's too little, then it's too hard to spend, so you're trying to find the right way. We saw that we had a coin shortage in this area, right? That made it harder for you to use money to spend, which made money actually more valuable in a very weird sense, right? The other part is this idea of interest rates. So the chairman of the Federal Reserve says this is the prime interest rate. And so no one lends money below the prime interest rate. So if you set the prime interest rate at 1%, then banks and other institutions will loan at 2 to 3%. Because they want to do better, right? They want to do better than the prime interest rate. If you set the prime interest rate at 4%, then most places will not have a loan that's less than 4%. So what you should be able to see here is if I am chairman of the Federal Reserve and I set it at 4%, banks will be people will be less likely to borrow at 5% than at 3%. So by setting the interest rate, the prime interest rate higher, that means there will be less loans. And less loans means less business, less growth, which means that if I set that interest rate higher, it will slow down the economy. If I set the interest rate lower, it'll speed up the economy. One of the reasons why why don't we just speed it up, right? We want a bigger economy, we want more jobs, and we want higher paying jobs. Why not just continue to speed up the economy? Because sometimes we have what's called a bubble, right? And hopefully you've heard this, there hasn't been a bubble that we've discussed, or we think student loans are the new bubble. But what happens is you have unsustainable growth, right? And this happens in 2008 to 2012 in the housing market, right? Home prices are going up, right? And so people are making a lot of money buying and selling homes, but wages aren't. Wages are staying the same, which means that the price of houses cannot continue to go up. And that's called a bubble. It's unsustainable. But what happens, what's really problematic, and the reason why we had the Great Recession in 2008 to 2012, or approximately 2000, is because it became very clear when those houses couldn't be held that people borrowed money they couldn't pay back. Or banks who wanted to make quick money were letting people buy homes that they couldn't possibly afford. Right? You had people with no income buying $400,000 homes, or some equivalent to today's market, right? And so what happens is eventually those people default on the home. And when a bubble bursts, it could be very problematic, right? The reason why we had the Great Depression is because there was speculation on land in the 1920s. And so the Great Depression is a direct result of land speculation. That's a bubble that burst, right? The recession we had is a bubble that burst. So when you have the economy speeding up very quickly, it's on the government to say, this looks like a bubble, I'm going to try and slow down. I'm going to create more regulations on buying a home. I'm going to make it harder to buy land, and I'm going to raise the interest rate. And that is, in the short run, in the next year or two, going to slow down the economy. But in the long run, when that bubble eventually bursts, because it's unsustainable, so it will burst at some point, it will at least be smaller. And we won't have a bust and boom cycle, right? We won't go from this big boom to this bust, right? We won't go from exponential growth to depression, right? And so that's part of the reason why we have monetary policy and a Federal Reserve System, is to try and keep that from occurring. It hasn't been very successful, but the point of it is trying to keep it occurring. We saw in 2008, right, there was a $700 billion bank bailout. We could not afford for our banks to collapse in the United States. It cost $700 billion because they had absorbed so many toxic assets, mostly homes, right, that they needed us to come in and buy those homes at a certain amount in order for these banks not to collapse. Well, actually, we didn't buy the homes. We invested in the banks, and they eventually sold the homes. But, right, this bailout. And we knew that if we had seen it coming and done something, it was preventable, right? So it cost the taxpayers $700 billion by not acting on that, right? So part of this is that bureaucrats failed in that case, and they really need to, they are necessary for a strong economy, right? To prevent things like a boom and bust cycle. You know, the revenue agency, there are two types of revenue agencies. There's the income and sort of there's the customs taxes, right? So the IRS deals just income. What did individuals and corporations make? What were their profits, right? How much did you make and how much is taxable? That allows us to make sure we're collecting taxes. The IRS in the United States is a very feared organization. One of the things about the United States is people believe that you have to pay taxes, right? The IRS went into Greece when they were in a financial crisis because one of the things is that tax collection is not very good in Greece, right? And what they decided is that you can't, excuse me, you can't use a rules-based system in Greece because people don't believe in it, right? This is the other part of bureaucracy. You have expertise. You have rule-based decision in the IRS, but you also needed belief in the system. Americans believe that if they don't pay taxes, they will go to jail. They believe that, right? We know that they believe that. But also, the Americans who don't pay taxes go to jail, right? Now, we have some obvious exceptions today, and right, whether or not you can use a corporation to hide and shell games, right? There are all these legal processes they try to evade the IRS, right? But the IRS has been very successful at catching people who violated the law and didn't pay their share of taxes, right? Now, we're going to see in the next few years if there's more change in that behavior, but they only deal with the income that corporations and people make. A very separate agency is tariffs and imports. When you're trying to maintain a strong economy, and this is really between China and the United States in the last few years, China might make a product very cheaply, right? China might make a specific product, whatever it is, right? A small statue. And they can make it for 3 cents, and the United States can only make it for 8 cents, right? It costs us significantly more to make it, right? Labor conditions are more expensive in the United States. A tariff of 5 cents would make the Chinese product more expensive. And by making it more expensive, it would create artificial competition between the American-made product and the Chinese-made product. Now, in part, that allows the American company to do better, right? The American company and the American jobs. Remember, we're not worried about a strong global economy. We're worried about a strong national economy. So it allows those American businesses to do better by limiting competition from outside. The other thing is if something is made so cheaply that it basically loses value, you want to stop what is called dumping, right? And so sometimes, and I'm using China as an example because they have a lot of exports, not because of some other, right, stereotypical belief, right? Just today, China and the United States have a big trade war. They are in the middle of sort of trade issues, right? China might make rice or might get rice at a much cheaper price and might try to dump it in the US to bottom out rice prices in the United States. Sometimes it's because they have so much rice and if they don't get it out of their storehouses, it's just going to rot, right? Rice has a shelf life. But on the other side, one of the reasons why they might do it is because they might want to limit how much production is in the US market. If I can just dump tons of rice into your market, then your domestic producers won't be able to keep up and they might collapse. And then 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I can raise the price of rice to meet something that I want because I've already destroyed your market, right? Sometimes we talk about Walmart doing this, right? Why are there so few mom and pop operations in the United States? In large part because Walmart sold products at such a low price that the other companies couldn't keep up. And then once those companies were gone, they raised the price, right? It's a very normal market behavior. It's actually monopolistic competition. It's a way in which you can get rid of your opponent or other corporations through low prices. So we want tariffs to prevent that. We want to make sure we protect American companies. We want to make sure that we make it to where even though American labor is more expensive, that the companies that use American labor are still competitive. And so the Customs Service does a lot of that to try and maintain our economy. There are also two different economic development agencies, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Transportation. The Department of Agriculture grows certain crops specifically to be buried into the ground, right? So sometimes if I want the price of soybeans to not be too low, as the American government, I might tell a farmer to just bury his crops into the ground. And that will decrease the supply of crops and increase that. Or I might try to tell farmers to grow different crops so that are much more competitive, right? California used to have a lot of seasonal crops, and they got rid of all of them to grow cashews and almonds. Why did they get rid of them to grow cashews and almonds? Because cashews and almonds are so prominent in more vegetarian diets or milk alternatives that they're very profitable. A cashew is by far the most profitable thing you can grow in California. It requires more resources, but the Department of Agriculture recognized that was a growth market and worked with those California farmers to switch from what they were growing, which was not going to be valuable in a few years, to something that can continue to be profitable. It also requires more water and it contributes to drought conditions, but those are other issues in the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Transportation, all of you saw this, right? Most of you, unless you just moved here, right? The 95, there is a brand new giant section of the 95 that was developed in the last 10 years, right? Or 8 years, whatever it was, right? That's not just to ease traffic here. The point of that is to make it easier to get into the Las Vegas area, specifically the Strip area, so that people have an easier time getting there. Because if they have an easier time getting there, more traffic will come in, and that means our capacity to bring in outsiders is more, and therefore we will have more people coming in. So the Department of Transportation is directly involved in producing a better economy, because if you have better roads and you have easier access to certain places, then one, tourists will come through more easily, and you'll get more external money, right? Money from other places, right? We don't just have tourism from California, but from China, Taiwan, Singapore, right? Mexico, from all over the world, people come to Las Vegas, right? Las Vegas is known globally. People come here and they bring their money and it produces a strong economy. The other part is that so many of our goods come along roadways, and bad roads, we know this, bad roads cause damage to tires. And so the Department of Transportation, if they make the roads better, then transportation companies can charge less because they're having less wear and tear on their vehicles. They can charge less for shipping, and therefore there will be more shipping. And because right now we're in a pandemic, right, lower shipping costs would mean a great deal to the U.S. economy, right? So these development agencies try to produce projects and infrastructure that help the American economy run. They're development agencies. Okay. So it used to be that even though we had a meritocracy, right, you had to take a test to get into a job. What happened is, even though you had to take a test and you had to have certain merits, it was very easy for you to get fired if you didn't really follow the will, right? And we actually saw this during the Trump administration. Even if you were a bureaucrat, because you worked for the federal government, the president could fire you. Or if your political alignment wasn't good enough, he could ask for your resignation, right? And so there needed to be, in 1993, Clinton realized, he didn't realize, he was pressured into this sort of idea of a performance review. And one of the things was that we need to start making it harder to use non-rule-based decisions, one, to get rid of people, but two, that we need to start getting rid of things that aren't performing at a high level, national performance review. So in the 90s, we saw a lot of military bases that didn't need to exist, right? You don't need a military base in every state. So you're gonna have a lot of military bases closed. And that's bad for those states, but it's good for the national economy, right? This is also sort of the competition is. We talked about that tank, the M1 Abrams tank, right? Why do we still produce the M1 Abrams tank? Because it's good for that local economy, but it's bad for the national economy. So it survived this base closings. But there are a lot of bases that closed in the 90s. There's also a lot of elimination of federal bureaucracy, right? We already talked about this, right? This was being pushed politically, and it was sort of already occurring technologically. In the 90s, you saw a lot of bureaucracy shrink and disappear, right? Because of advances in technology, right? Policy just sort of said, we can do this more efficiently. So it was just a recognition of politicians that it can be more efficient and sort of pushing for better efficiency. Also to sort of save the money that would be spent, that could be spent elsewhere. We already talked about devolution, right? Devolution starts with Reagan, right? This idea that you take the federal government and instead you run it at the state level, right? One of the reasons was that most states can't run a deficit, right? In fact, I don't think any state can run a deficit, right? You're not allowed to borrow as a state. You have to borrow as a federal government. And so what happens in the first case is that you have to be more efficient in your bureaucracy if you can't borrow money, right? States have to be much more efficient in the bureaucracy because they're not allowed to go into debt, right? Nevada can't go into debt, right? There's a biennial budget. We already talked about this in the last section, right? It cannot go into debt, and therefore it can't borrow. And because of that, the bureaucracy is going to shrink because you don't have the money. It doesn't matter if you're providing good services. Now, to make a strong economy, you're willing to shrink those services because they're in a state situation that can't borrow against it. So at least you won't go into debt providing those services. We talked about the liabilities, right? Why is Nevada in such a bad situation when it's providing its own services rather than the federal government? Because we won't allow any sort of taxing to increase, right? We won't allow income tax. We won't allow an increase in estate tax. We won't allow a lot of new business taxes to come in, and therefore taxing is lower in Nevada, which means it makes for a stronger economy, but it provides worse services to those people who need them, right? So there's a liability there. It is much more efficient and flexible, though. By putting in each state, the federal government doesn't decide how much is spent, states decide. So if you have limited resources, all of you have limited resources, right? None of you are millionaires or billionaires, and if you are, why are you in my class, right? But if you are not, right, you're always deciding, right? I have X amount of dollars. I pay all my bills. Hopefully you're in a situation where you pay all your bills, and then let's say you have $10 left, right? And I'm using an imaginary number. Please, I hope that's not true that you pay your bills and have $10 left. But if you have $10 and you want something, you want some object, right? Whatever it is, you have to decide between that object and another object, right? And you might say, oh, I'm a nerd, so I really want the statue of Wonder Woman, but it's $10. It would be all my spending money for the rest, and that's very low cost for a statue, but right, that would be all of my money. Or I can go out to eat twice, right? And obviously use imaginary numbers because you can't go out to eat twice for $10. But in all of those cases, you have to make decisions. And so states are using that to be flexible. And because they're using that, they're spending the money where it's most needed, where they are expected to spend the money where it's most needed. There's actually a state, I want to say either Arkansas or Tennessee, where they hire attorneys to sue mothers on behalf of the unborn. And there's no way that the way that the law works, I'm not making a political statement, let me be very clear. It's not pro-life versus pro-choice. It's that the laws are very clear that you cannot defend the unborn, right? So they're spending money to hire attorneys who can't actually go into courtrooms. That's very inefficient. So it's not a guarantee of efficiency, but it at least promotes efficiency by making you decide how you're going to spend your money, right? The poorer you are, the more efficient you become with funding, right? Out of necessity, right? Poor people are typically better at money management because they don't have a choice, right? That they have to find a way to survive. And then flexibility, right? That I can't afford this part, so I have to move into and find the things that I can actually buy that will benefit my state. The other part that we expect is this idea of privatization, right? It used to be, it never was clearly perfect, all public services, but now instead of me providing the service, I'm going to go to a private company, right? And the most obvious example, John Oliver covered this. So if you have HBO, which is very expensive, but please don't steal anything because I mentioned it. But John Oliver does this thing where instead of you paying a court, right? Say you owe the court $40. And instead of you paying the court and the court having to go after you, courts now use a collection agency. And the collection agency, yes, they guarantee $40 to the court, right? And then they come after you. But what they do is they add interest, they add fees. And so what was before a $40 fine to the court is now going to end up being $100 or $200 for you to try and pay that in through privatization. So the private companies are making it harder on individuals, but what we do see is even though it might create greater costs on the individuals in that specific John Oliver case that I'm talking about, right? The courts get their money guaranteed. They get their money guaranteed with no fee. They said, no, we'll just handle all of it and we'll put all the costs on the defendants. So because of that, government arbitration can be very efficient. Most military contracts, right, they're private, right? Lockheed Martin, Kellogg Brown and Root, right? Boeing, these are all private companies that provide most of our advancements in military, right? Most military advancement comes from private companies today. However, right, in the textbook, this is the 2017 textbook, right, on page 571, they say that there's no evidence, there's no good evidence that privatization saves the government money, right? Privatization does not necessarily save the government money. We're going to continue to look at that. We will probably see that on a much closer microscope in the next few years because we're so indebted. The amount of national debt and the amount of student debt is so high because of privatization that there might be some need to review that. And you'll probably see that after the pandemic is resolved. If we get the pandemic resolved in the next year or two, then you'll probably have a look at education and other types of privatization that have occurred to see if they're really saving the government money. In some cases, we have a blended workforce. So the Postal Service, not the best case, but the Postal Service, they're not allowed to have any mail the Postal Service at the end of the day cannot have any mail in their building, right? When you go to the post office, there can be no mail left in that post office at the end of the day, right? When they're shutting the clock, they put it all in baskets and they put it in a truck and it goes to a sorting center. It has to be empty at the end of the day. If you have something that's overnight, right, they don't have the capability to do that. So it has been a long-standing practice that if they have a piece of mail that you have given to them and paid for them to ship, and they can't get it out in that day, it cannot stay in there. So they will take it to FedEx and have FedEx ship it overnight to the next point, right? That's a blended workforce. I'm using a private company to do that. Now the post office does that because they have rules about having mail, unshipped mail. They cannot have unshipped mail in their facility at the end of the day. That's a rule that makes them use a private workforce. But you also have a blended workforce, right? The military is a much more obvious example of blended workforce, right? Kellogg's Brown and Root is building the roads and the highways and the airports that the military uses. So you have infrastructure being privatized and the actual combat arms and combat service support still remaining in the military. You also have a lot more private militaries that are being used by the United States government, right? It's much less politically costly to say that private military groups died in a combat than to say soldiers died in a combat, right? So you're going to continue to see this blended workforce. And then KBR is one of these examples about why we don't have savings, is because KBR is one of the few companies that will build infrastructure in combat zones. And so they have what's called a no-bid contract. The government says, KBR, we need you to go and build roads here. And then KBR says how much it will cost, but there's no competition. And without competition in the bidding process, right, of course, we're going to pay higher costs, right? All of you should be familiar with this. We talked about in the United States, the government is not allowed to negotiate prescription prices. If you can't negotiate prices, you're going to pay more than people who get to negotiate prices. So that used to be the case, that is the case today, but now we're saying we need to be able to negotiate prices, right? And that's part of this idea of some privatization is there has to be, if there's going to be privatization, there has to be reform so we can actually find efficient ways to do it. Okay. Let's just, so let's take a second. I'm not going to talk about these lectures. We're going to be on managing the bureaucracy. I obviously care about a lot of this. I know it's a little boring, but I love this. Like, this is a big part of my life now. So I don't want to try and cram the last 3 slides into 5 minutes. And I want to get you out of here in time. And I want you to talk about the paper. So I'm going to bring up this just in case there are questions. The paper's due Thursday, right? The prompt is up. The articles are there. I have gotten a couple to grade. So a couple of things. Make sure that you are using your language. Don't use quotes. I don't need you to quote, right? Don't say, oh, here's exactly what they said. Use your words, right? And I know it's confusing people in the classroom, they see me, but make sure you're using the words that you know to describe the things that you have read. Make it clear that you've read the articles, right? Talk about the things that the articles talk about, but use your words. So don't use quotes. Don't quote something. Make sure that it's original what you're saying, right? This is your thoughts, right? I read this and this made me think, based on this, this is what I think, right? So you are making an argument, right? Not a normative argument. You're not saying I like this, I don't like this, right? This is morally bad or morally wrong. But there was this statement made, right? And I'm going to give you one of the pieces talks about that we'll probably see less drunk drivers, right? And I know a lot of you are going to talk about this, so I'm not worried, right? But if you haven't read this, you'll notice it in the article. There's an expectation that there will be less drunk drivers if marijuana is legalized, because marijuana is a more private activity. It's not as much a public activity. So people will be home smoking marijuana, and therefore, if they are drinking, they won't go out places to draw, right? So driving under the influence should go down, right? But you might say by legalizing it, it'll stop being a private activity. That's an argument you could make, right? So you can choose either side of this. But by talking about those, right? Notice I didn't quote, right? There is a specific author. Make sure you cite that author, right? But I didn't quote. I talked about the ways that the arguments are made and how to interpret them, right? So that's what I want to see. Remember, I have read these articles. You do have to show me that you've read them because I know what the material is. What I want you to do is take, here's what I read, here's the arguments that I have made based on them, and the arguments I make show that I've read the articles, right? Arguments, and I think one person turned it in and they got a 20 out of 20, right? One person has turned it in and got a 20 out of 20, and so make sure you're saying this is what the articles say, this is my interpretation of them, and what their arguments mean, and this is why I either agree or disagree. And use evidence, use other evidence to argue. Just don't cite any other sources. Please do not copy and paste anything. I mean, you can copy and paste my works cited, like I have those works cited. You can copy and paste that. You can copy and paste the in-text citations I use, but everything else type up. Don't use quotes, use your words. And make sure you have one sentence on the fifth page. One sentence on the fifth page, right? Use normal margins. I don't want any, I only want your name, right? You can have your name and a title, but don't put the course number and then the date. All that looks like when you do, like, here's the course number, the date, the name, all that does, it makes it look like you're spacing the paper. You're trying to make the paper artificially longer. So a double space 5 pages is already pretty short, right? Make the arguments you need to make. And if you make the arguments you need to make and cover the articles, it should take you into that fifth page quite easily on double space 12-point font paper, right? Don't mess with the margins. It's very easy for me to mess with margins. Also, remember, you're putting it through Turnitin. Because you're putting Turnitin, I'm going to see wherever you pulled from other sources. And if you overuse other sources, that's called plagiarism if they're not cited. And if you overuse other sources and you still cite it, but you're still using different sources, where's your argument? Where are your words, right? I'm grading your material, not the material. I don't grade those articles. I grade your material. So provide your arguments in the best way that you can. Okay, that's it for today. I want to get you guys out of here on time. So have a good day. If you have questions, email me. I was not checking my email, right? I was dealing with a lot of post-election sort of research. But tonight I'm going to be looking at emails, and then tomorrow if you have questions. And then if you turn in the paper, remember, I have a grade floor. So the worst case, even if you turn in a paper that's bad, but you're like, look, I read the material and I did this, I'm still going to give you a minimum grade, right? I'm going to say you completed this project. So the most, you just finish it and you will probably get a B or a C if you just do the work, right? Getting beyond a 16 out of 20, that's going to be much harder. But do the work, turn in the paper. If you don't, why am I stressing this so much? If you don't turn in the paper, you're going to fail. I can almost guarantee you will fail. No one has passed this class who didn't turn in a paper. Turn in a paper. And I've only gotten 2 out of 43. I'm obviously very concerned about this, right? As you can tell, make sure you turn in something. And if you're struggling, talk to me tonight. Email me today. I will be on my email. I'll be checking things. I'll be available to chat in the chat window if that's what you need. I will be available tonight to resolve these issues. Okay. Everyone have a good day. Thank you for watching the live stream.